Hey everyone, we're just gonna wait a few minutes and we'll get started at 8:05. All right. Hi everyone. My name is Reshma Ramachandran. I'm the DFA Doctors for America Drug Affordability Action Team co-chair, and I'm thrilled to have you all today for our session on protecting patients through clinical trials transparency. As folks may know, today is International Clinical Trials Day, and we wanted to commemorate it with efforts from various organizations that are leading the charge to ensure clinical trials transparency, both of results as well as their costs, in order to protect our patients. We have a great lineup here today, and I'm going to introduce first our moderator. Our moderator is Chris Morden. He is the Deputy Director of the NYU Law, Technology Law and Policy Clinic. He has done incredible work in this field, both on clinical trial transparency in terms of results, as well as costs. He actually represents Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, which will be speaking today about their ongoing efforts to ensure this transparency in academic institutions, and has represented MSF, Doctors Without Borders USA, in their efforts to make sure that the costs for these clinical trials are also made public. Well, without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Chris so he can take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Reshma, and thanks, Doctors for America, for convening this great event on the special occasion of International Clinical Trials Day. And thanks to Ava and Nilu and Defna and MSF and UAM for sharing their important work, which I want to get to quickly. So I have just a minute or two of opening remarks. So the focus of today's event is clinical trial transparency, which begs the question, what do we mean by transparency? Nilu, Defna, and Ava will explain more, but in my view, trial transparency means protecting and expanding patients and the public's right to share in and benefit from the knowledge that's generated in clinical trials. That transparency spans the entire life cycle of a trial. So that means registering trials when they begin, sharing trial protocols and statistical analysis plans early on, and anytime a protocol gets amended, sharing trial results promptly after trials are completed. And that means both easy to understand summary results for patients and more detailed data like clinical study reports and even full data sets for providers and for researchers. And finally, transparency includes sharing financial data on the costs of each trial and who funded it. Why does all this matter? In 2016, MSF published a fantastic white paper called Lives on the Edge that explains in detail the harms caused by lack of transparency into clinical trials. And I will try to drop a link to that report into the chat. Let's see if that works. So I won't rehash everything that's in this detailed and really excellent report, but the report shows, MSF has shown that lack of transparency harms the participants in clinical trials who subject themselves to experimental treatment on the expectation that they will help to generate important new knowledge. Knowledge that is then lost if the trial results are kept secret. Lack of transparency also harms patients and their doctors by depriving them of safety and efficacy information that should guide clinical care. Obviously, every doctor's nightmare is to prescribe a patient a drug that proves toxic or ineffective. And when drug companies or universities or other trial sponsors hide trial data, the risk of that is real. Lack of transparency also contributes to the high costs of drugs, devices, and other medical technologies in the United States, in part by obscuring the true value of these products, making it harder for payers to negotiate a fair price. Lack of transparency slows the advance of science as it forces researchers to retrace steps or sometimes miss out altogether on promising new areas for research. And finally, lack of transparency can undermine public trust in the FDA, in NIH, and in other government agencies. So right now, as our amazing speakers will explain, the US and the rest of the world are falling short on transparency. There's been some improvement in the last decade or two, but we still have a lot to do, both on trial results and on trial costs. But fortunately, UAM and MSF are hard at work on those two problems. So I'm going to start by turning the mic over to UAM, which has been a leader in the fight to compel universities and other trial sponsors to share their trial results. So Nilu and Defna, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. I'll go ahead and share my slides. 1 second. Okay. So Daphne and I will be just presenting a bit of a background on the transparency report and some of the work that UAM has done. But I'm Nilu. I just graduated from Penn, and I've been involved with UAM since 2019, mostly working on this transparency campaign. So it's been a pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to this. So just some background. The UAM transparency campaign started in 2019, and basically, the transparency report has been a tool for us, and it allows us to, further our goals in terms of how do we demand clinical trial results in a timely manner. So universities are mandated by federal law to report their clinical trials, and universities and other sponsors included. So within this fight, we use the transparency report as this tool to measure accountability and measure how universities are reporting these trials. So we'll talk a bit about the transparency report and what UAM does for clinical trials transparency. So basically, as I said, this campaign started in 2019. Before we launched this campaign in 2012, 80% of trials were non-compliant under law. So this is the FDAAA that we're speaking about, and this was enforced in 2007, and it came into effect in 2017 fully, and essentially mandates that clinical trial sponsors report their clinical trials within 1 year of completion. And every day that it's late, they're technically subject to $10,000 of fines. However, we'll speak a bit more about this, but they've never really been enforced, or the fines have never been collected. So within all this, we're basically trying to see what the role of universities is throughout all this. So UAM works a lot with university students at different levels, and we recognize that universities are largely involved in early stage clinical research that is very important to furthering the goals and furthering this clinical research before it's handed on to maybe a broader scale where pharmaceutical companies and other sponsors can take this research forward. So our question was, how can university students be implicated in this process, and how can we change the low reporting rates of universities specifically? So through the 2019 transparency report that UAM released, we basically, some key results that we found were that 13 out of 40 universities that we measured were fully compliant. So 100% of results had been reported. 24 out of these 40 research universities had reporting rates below 80%. So this was anywhere from 30, 19% upwards of like 70, 80, some above 80%, but not nearly the rates that we would want to see. And 31% of trials were unreported. So this was 138 trials out of 446 at the time when this report was published. So clearly, as you can see, there was a big problem, especially at the time, in terms of how universities rank in terms of reporting. And this was only a subset of 40 universities. So basically, the transparency report analyzed how clinical trials are reported by universities. This on the right is just a sneak peek from our upcoming report that we'll talk more about. But just looking at how the rates have differed from 2019 to 2021. And again, this is all measured in terms of how how universities are reporting as mandated by the FDAAA.
Okay, so Nilu already started getting into this a bit, but one of the biggest questions we get in the course of this work is why specifically we focus on universities. And beyond the fact that we're an organization that works with universities on a day-to-day basis, there are a couple good reasons to look into reporting rates at universities specifically. And one of these is just accountability. As Nilu mentioned, one of the main goals of this project is to keep universities accountable and to make sure that they are sharing the results of their work in the way that they're mandated to do. So universities receive over $40 billion in research funding, in federal research funding each year. And about 40% of that funding goes towards clinical research. So the premise that we're really acting on here is that the results of publicly funded research should be accessible to the public. And clinical trial transparency is at least one step towards achieving that. The second point is a bit more depressing, and it's that universities actually have much lower reporting rates overall when compared to other pharmaceutical industry stakeholders in the pharmaceutical industry, which, there are several reasons for that, including resource limitations or just the fact that it's not prioritized as much. But it's clear that universities do need a bit more of a push in really achieving better reporting rates. And finally, as Nilu also mentioned, there is a question of impact. Universities and cancer centers and other publicly funded research institutions conduct the majority of clinical trials in the US, so they have enormous influence on the R&D process as a whole. And specifically, what we see is that universities are very much involved in earlier stage clinical research that defines the direction and trajectory and even design of future studies. So we really think that it's important to focus on them as important stakeholders. And we've seen this playing out during the COVID pandemic in the last year as well, with universities really stepping up and taking part in the clinical research process. And in fact, 35 of the institutions that we included in the most recent iteration of our report, which we're launching next week, are actively engaged in clinical trials around COVID health technologies.
Yeah, so as Daphne mentioned, our report, our 2021 report, which is essentially a follow-up from our 2019 report, measures the same top 40 research universities that we looked at in our previous report. And basically these universities are sponsoring the most number of clinical trials subject to the FDAAA, which is why we chose this subset of schools. We also looked at affiliated medical schools with these universities as well as cancer centers, just to identify what are other areas of research. And specifically with cancer centers, this looks at a different subset of research and shows exactly how universities are performing across the board in terms of different types of research, and ensuring that we're keeping them accountable for every clinical trial that's done. So we'll just be talking about some of our key findings. Again, this is data that has not yet been publicly released, but it will be released in a more detailed manner in our report next Wednesday. So you can definitely read that report to find out more about these, but this is just a snapshot of some of those findings.
Okay, so just to start by looking at the big picture, when we look at all applicable clinical trials that are currently due for reporting, all trials sponsored by all types of institutions. At the moment, about a third of them are missing results on clinicaltrials.gov still. So as of this morning, that accounts to more than 2,700 clinical trials based on data that is collected by the FDAAA trials tracker that scrapes data directly from clinicaltrials.gov. So again, to reiterate, our study only looks at a very small subset of these trials. So all of the figures that we'll be sharing with you today represent only a fraction of trials that are missing results at the moment. So if we can go on to the next slide. Before we dive into the numbers, what we're really seeing here in general is that the FDA has really failed to create a system that would adequately ensure complete reporting of clinical trial results. So as Nilu mentioned, there are financial penalties attached to this law. So our favorite fun fact within the campaign is that if the FDA were to actually enforce the law, it would be due to collect about $19 billion in fines as of this morning, which is a shocking number. And it really shows the scale of the issue. And this number increases exponentially as trial sponsors continue to be late in reporting results. And we are going to be talking a little bit more about what enforcement looks like at the moment in a couple of minutes.
So maybe some more positive news in everything that we've said is just some of our results from this most recent 2021 report. And it's a good thing that we've basically seen that the percentage of unreported trials has decreased from 31% to 6%. And this is largely due to the work of our allies and UAM as well, in terms of student activism and communicating with policymakers and even just the universities themselves and speaking to the administrations and finding out what the problems are and everything like that. So we'll be talking more about that, but that is a big improvement in terms of just the percentage. We also see that 16 institutions are now fully compliant at 100% reporting, and this is up from 13% in 2019. So that's a very good news. And then one of the biggest things that we've also seen is just how the number of institutions that are above 80%. So even though not all universities are at the 100% range, and that's the ideal goal, we have seen a lot of universities step up above the 80%. So a lot are between this 80 to 100% range. And this is now 36 institutions, which is up from, I think, 19 or in that range before. So definitely a big improvement. But however, we still should remember that 108 trials still remain unreported. So this is across the different schools. And this is also important just because we're also stressing the way trials are reported and the protocols that are found within each institution. So we want to ensure that each university has a protocol and a set of staff dedicated to reporting these trials. So, in the process, we hope to build these structures within each university, and this can eventually achieve 100% reporting as well. So again, on the right, this is another figure from our report. So as you can see, a lot of these universities are above this 70 to 80% range. So if not 100, they're very, very, very close, despite having a few laggers here, which we'll talk about.
And here again, you can see a comparison of how reporting rates have changed from 2019 to 2021. So the blue dots here are reporting rates by university in 2019. The reds are 2021, and the size of the bubbles here represent the number of trials that each university is running. So already it's pretty clear that there is a very nice positive trend that we're seeing here, with a lot of universities now being above 80%, above 90% reporting, even though the reporting rates were much, much lower 2 years ago. And this is despite the fact that the total number of clinical trials due for reporting actually increased almost threefold. So that is really encouraging. And we also had the opportunity of following up with a lot of universities that we targeted in our initial report after our 2019 launch. We started interviewing administrators and research support staff at those universities, and a lot of them indicated that there was heightened attention on results reporting and clinical trial transparency across their institutions, which was very encouraging, to be honest. And some of them mentioned that they had hired full-time staff members to manage the reporting process or were developing more sophisticated clinical trial management systems. And all of these really point towards the potential, at least, of much more significant improvement down the line, which is why we're here, which is why we do this work.
Yeah, and more positive news. We've seen a lot of universities make big improvements in the way they've reported from 2019 till now. So Northwestern and Columbia have been some of our key players in this area. So Columbia, I think, was around 16%, 16.7%, as I remember in 2019, and now they're at 100%. So it just shows how much improvement there has been. And there's been continuous reporting of trials even in CTGov. So the number of trials that were in CTGov was around 446, and now that number is well above 1,500. So we see a lot of this improvement and consistent reporting of trials within the database as well. So both these universities have had below 30% in the past, but are now at 100%. So this just shows some of the work of our activism and the work of our allies as well. So it's very positive news. And these are just some of the other universities that have also been making big improvements. One thing to also mention is that there have been some schools that have been on the opposite side and have decreased a little. So that's also something to note in terms of future activism and future efforts and targets that we can have for campaigns. So yeah, so again, there's more work to be done. These are some of the biggest players in terms of trials left to be reported. So big research universities that we've all heard of, Stanford, NYU Langone, University of Washington, Colorado, UCSD, all these universities, and some of them like University of Cincinnati, they've been repeated offenders. So they've been consistently bad since 2019. So that's, again, another target that we can make in terms of how do we work with them to build up these structures that enable consistent reporting. And again, one more thing to mention is that we are only looking at 40 top research universities, but there's many other research universities that are engaging in this type of clinical research that also hold many more clinical trials that are yet to be reported. And while we can't really focus on all of them in this report, we can provide the resources to, further this activism at these different universities. So if you are a student or someone who works at these other universities and would like to know more, we'd love to work with you to, work with university administrators to communicate more about this issue as well.
Okay, and without getting into too much detail, we also wanted to highlight a couple of recent developments that have happened in the very small world of transparency that we're really excited about. One is a court ruling that was announced in the last year that basically says that clinical trials completed between 2007 and 2017, which were previously exempt from reporting requirements under the FDAAA because of a legal loophole, will now also be required to report results. So this means that universities and other trial sponsors now have to take a step back and look at their clinical research portfolios in the last decade to really start reporting results and making public those results of the trials that they had been ignoring so far. So that is definitely a very positive development, and shout out to Chris and everyone else at the Yale Media Freedom and Information Access Clinic and the NYU Technology Law and Policy Clinic for making this possible and really taking the lead. This is a super, super exciting development, and it really is a huge step towards more broadly transparency in clinical research. So that has been amazing. And another very recent development, which is also potentially an extension of some of UAM's collaborations with, again, Chris and Reshma and the team at the NYU Law Clinic, who've been submitting a series of FOIA requests to better understand what the FDA has actually been doing to enforce the FDAAA and what's really been going on in the background. And very recently, only a couple of weeks ago, the FDA actually sent out its first ever notice of non-compliance to a clinical trial sponsor who'd been late in reporting results on some of their trials. More updates to come, but this is definitely a major step. As one of our biggest issues within this campaign had been that the law that we were basing it on had never been enforced. So now it looks like there is more activity in the FDA and more updates to come. And we're very excited to see how things turn out.
Yeah, so again, if you, we'll be talking more, but this is just our contact info, and yeah.
Awesome. Nilu and Daphne, thank you both so much for sharing that amazing work. And I know that you guys are two of the leaders, two of the drivers of this incredible work on clinical trial transparency at UAM, but I know there are other folks too on the trial transparency team. And this has obviously been a multi-year effort, and it's just so cool to see it pay off at the last months. So as a kind of procedural thing, I forgot to say this at the outset, but we would love for all attendees to submit their questions. You should have on your Zoom screen an option to submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can also put a question into chat, and the panelists should be able to see it that way. So either way should work. I don't think we can see your hands if you raise your hands. So the best way to submit questions is either by chat or through the Q&A function. And the plan is we'll have a short Q&A, just a couple minutes on UAM's work, and then I'll turn the floor over to Ava, and we'll talk about MSF. And then we will have, I hope, about 10 minutes or so at the end for kind of combined Q&A that covers everything. Can I exercise my moderator's privilege and ask Nilu and Daphne, just one question, which is, you mentioned this, I think you said, some of our attendees tonight are probably at major research universities, including some of the universities I'm at NYU, and NYU is now one of the laggards on trial transparency. And you mentioned that it was UAM and UAM's outreach to these institutions that really helped improve compliance, improve reporting. Could you talk more about sort of how you were able to work with individual researchers, doctors at different institutions? And do you have any kind of advice for folks who might be listening and want to take a first step towards helping their own institution improve?
Absolutely. So we actually have a parallel project, that we're running in conjunction with this, which is basically a roadmap of clinical trial results reporting on the ground. So we have had the opportunity to interview over 50, I think, clinical research administrators and individual researchers at a variety of institutions, just to get a better feel for what the process actually looks like on the ground. And what we've noticed is that sometimes the issue is actually very, very simple to solve. Sometimes it's just a matter of people not knowing who is specifically responsible for uploading the results. It can be something as simple as that, or not having a management system that actually keeps track of trials, because it's really difficult to keep track of 50 trials on a whiteboard or even an Excel spreadsheet. And there are some really simple tools that can make people's lives a lot easier. But because this is not necessarily an issue that gets a lot of attention within university spheres or isn't even included in research training for the most part at universities, it's very difficult to really get into the weeds. So one organization that we've actually been collaborating with is the Clinical Trial Registration and Results Reporting Task Force, which is a consortium of research administrators from a variety of hospitals and universities across the US. And they've actually put together a lot of very helpful toolkits that help new research administrators get up to speed and really get a grip on the process so that they can help researchers navigate the entire registration and results reporting. I want to say maze at this point, because there are a lot of details once you get into the weeds. But beyond that, student activism definitely helps support those efforts, because one thing that a lot of research administrators point to is just the fact that their lives get so much easier when university administrators support their work. So that's how they get funding, that's how they get resources, that's how their work gets prioritized within the research process. So just having that conceptual support around transparency is really a huge push.
That's great. That's so interesting to hear. And one thing that pops into my head is that it sounds like the process of submitting data to clinicaltrials.gov is not as user-friendly as it could be. Maybe it should be. Yeah, I see you both reacting. And so, one other sort of policy goal or kind of pressure point, I think, for clinical trial transparency could be on NIH, which administers the clinicaltrials.gov website, making sure that it is doing everything it can to help universities and other trial sponsors comply with the law and submit their data. And I think UAM has done some work on that as well. In the interest of time, I might, I see, so Navia Dasari, one of our attendees, asked a question, but she then said that we've sort of already covered it. So, oh, here we go. Here's another question from Navia that I'll pose. And then I think we'll wrap up and turn the floor over to Ava. The question is, have you encountered any resistance university administrators have to taking these steps?
I would say absolutely. I think there, it's always, there's always resistance to move from the status quo. So obviously universities are going to have to spend more of their funds and, appoint these people and staff to manage these trials and eventually report them. So it is a bit of a logistical problem for them. So I think like the biggest thing that we've done to counter this resistance is to work with them instead of against them, and making sure that if there is a problem in terms of staffing, or if there's a problem in terms of the awareness around which trials must be submitted or what the responsibilities of these universities are, just making sure that we can counter that and help them better understand that. But also just, making sure that students are also engaged on campuses and making sure that they're bringing these problems to the forefront of their universities. I think that's the biggest thing about UAM students, is that we play this unique role where we are able to talk to these administrators as unique stakeholders at these universities, so we can present our problems and make sure that they're aware that students and other, medical researchers or doctors or anyone else involved in this process, they're all aware of this issue and that they want this, and that they, that there is a moral and a financial and many other different reasons that they should be submitting these results in order to advance research. And a lot of these universities tout their big, research funds and NIH funds that they're granted. So really just using that to, to our advantage, and making sure that they're being accountable for that, for those funds as well.
That's great. Yeah, reminding them of their mission statements and making sure they live up to them. Wonderful. Daphne and Nilu, thank you so much for sharing that work. I think that we should, in the interest of time, let Ava present on the amazing work that she and MSF have done. And then we'll have a chance in the final Q&A. If folks have more questions about the clinical trial result transparency work that UAM is doing, we'll have another opportunity to ask questions then. So yeah, unless I'm forgetting anything, Ava, I think I will turn the floor over to you. Oh, quick thing, Nilu and Daphne, if and when you have a chance, could you put your contact information, if you're comfortable with folks emailing you, could you put that into the chat for attendees? Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Sorry, are you able to see the screen? Yes. Okay, good. All right, thank you. Thanks for that amazing presentation, UAM. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Reshma and Doctors for America for organizing this event and asking me to participate. Again, my name is Ava Alcon, and I serve as Policy and Research Officer at Doctors Without Borders, or MSF. I work in MSF's New York office, and much of my work is in collaboration with our Access campaign, looking at how policies in the US impact access to medicines globally. Let's see if I can advance my slides. Struggling to do that. Let's see. Sorry, all. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. See if I can keep advancing. So you may all already be familiar with the emergency and humanitarian operations that MSF runs around the world, but through the Access campaign, we also advocate for changes in the policies of governments and the practices of the pharmaceutical industry to try to increase access to drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics. The Access campaign exists because MSF sees significant gaps every day in the availability of medical tools our teams need to help the people that they serve. Sometimes it's a vaccine or a treatment that we need that just doesn't exist at all yet, or if it does, it's much too expensive, or maybe it needs to be stored in a specialized way that's not suitable for all of our projects. Beginning with antiretroviral drugs for HIV in the late 90s, the Access campaign has tried to both help MSF operations on the ground with immediate needs they have for specific products, and also work on upstream issues in the system of biomedical research and development that consistently keep drugs and medical tools from being available and affordable. So I'm joining today's session to share with you about one of these systemic issues that the Access campaign has been looking at for a long time, which, like a lot of others, COVID has just made more urgent and also more relevant to policymakers and citizens here in the US. And this issue, as Chris mentioned, is the lack of transparency around the costs of research and development of medical tools. MSF is totally aligned with UAM on the importance of transparency of clinical trial results too. We want to support and amplify the great work that you guys are doing. We've recently focused some of our own US-based research and advocacy, though, on this closely connected issue of clinical trial costs. And we've done this because medical tool developers so often use R&D spending, and especially the cost of clinical trials, to explain why they need to set product prices so high and focus on lucrative areas of research, which are not always the same as public health priorities. People in low and middle income countries are disproportionately impacted by the skewed R&D, which makes the issue especially important for MSF. But in wealthy countries like the US too, increasingly large numbers of us also feel the effects of unaffordable drugs, and certain areas of research that are important for public health get neglected here as well, of course. The result is that policymakers on both sides of the aisle express concern about drug affordability and say they want accountability for huge outlays of public money for R&D. So transparency reform here in the US seems possible to us politically. Given the US government's huge role in the innovation system as the largest funder of biomedical R&D in the world, a policy change in the US in this area would shine a light on the whole system and have far-reaching global effects. US is home to most of the largest pharmaceutical and biotech companies. Many medical tools are discovered and brought to market here, both for use in the US and around the world. And the US spends more on publicly funded biomedical research than any other nation, nearly $40 billion annually. This money flows in a number of ways through public research institutions, universities, public and private health systems, and directly to companies. NIH-funded research played a part in all 356 new drugs that were approved by the FDA from 2010 to 2019. And in the time of COVID, the US government is playing an even bigger role in R&D. The US has put about $18 billion into research and development of COVID vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics, plus many billions more that laid the groundwork for the breakthroughs that are happening now. These funds flow through multiple federal agencies, mostly under the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, including BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, NIH, CDC, and FDA, as well as others outside HHS, like the Department of Defense. MSF and others in both the US and around the world have long argued that such massive taxpayer contributions to R&D mean the public should get full transparency from the government about how these dollars are spent. We know development of medical tools is expensive, but little is known about the real costs of R&D because neither the pharmaceutical industry nor the government funders of R&D disclose detailed, disaggregated information about these expenses. And this lack of transparency, of course, serves the pharmaceutical industry well and leaves the public with little power to influence R&D or negotiate fair drug prices. So the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine is a prime example. The company is charging as much as $37 per dose, more than all the other approved vaccines. And the US government is spending billions to urgently purchase Moderna vaccine for Americans. But US taxpayers already made a massive investment, both in the mRNA technology that made this vaccine and Pfizer's possible, and directly in the development of the Moderna vaccine. BARDA gave Moderna almost $1 billion, and the NIH itself both ran and paid for the phase 3 clinical trial that brought the product to market. So the US government pretty much shepherded the vaccine through its whole journey from basic research to clinical use, and yet hasn't made public just how federal money was spent in the development of the vaccine, for instance, how much that crucial large-scale clinical trial cost. So there was this huge federal investment, and the US government is even a part owner in the technology that Moderna's vaccine production relies on, but we still allow the company to set the price and tightly control the manufacturing of the vaccine, which just means greater expenditures of public funds and restricted global access. In the case of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine too, NIH and the researchers who developed the vaccine's underlying mRNA technology and the German government gave BioNTech NIH funded the researchers who developed the underlying technology, and the German government gave BioNTech nearly $500 million to take it further. At the same time, now we're seeing in the first 3 months of 2021, Moderna's vaccine brought in $1.7 billion in sales and is estimated to bring in $19 billion this year, while Pfizer's vaccine has brought in $3.5 billion, and the company just upped its revenue projections for the vaccine for this year to $26 billion, up from $15 billion. So this practice of governments paying for R&D, failing to disclose the costs, and then failing to negotiate adequately on behalf of the public has pretty much been standard practice even before the pandemic. The public pays twice, first to fuel R&D, and then again when we or our governments purchase these medical tools. At MSF, we think that when companies get public funding and resources from US government agencies, the costs of developing these products should be totally transparent, especially because we believe at this point that the R&D system is not adequately aligned with public need. So COVID-19, again, is a great example. We're seeing stark inequities in the global distribution of the current vaccines, with wealthy countries having bought up existing supplies. Of the doses administered this far, more than 80% have been in high-income countries, and only a fraction of 1% have been given in low-income countries. The COVAX facility, the global initiative meant to deliver COVID-19 vaccines based on public health needs, aims to vaccinate only 3.3% of people in the countries relying on it by the middle of this year. But with supply delays, COVAX is struggling mightily to deliver on this promise and probably won't. Most COVAX doses won't reach member countries until the second half of 2021, and it's estimated that many people in low and middle income countries won't receive adequate supplies of vaccines until at least 2023. Because of these inequities, MSF is calling not only for transparency, but for the US to both immediately share doses with COVAX and use its leverage with companies to make rapid tech transfer happen and scale up vaccine manufacturing around the world, particularly in places where there isn't any already. So COVID has highlighted this misalignment between public health need and what biomedical innovation delivers. But because of what MSF sees in its operations, this broken R&D system has been a focus of the Access campaign for many years. To give you a recent example, in 2019, MSF launched an international campaign aimed at Johnson & Johnson, trying to get the company to lower the price of the breakthrough tuberculosis drug bedaquiline. Even J&J's so-called nonprofit price for the drug had made it inaccessible to many health systems that needed it most around the world, putting it out of reach of thousands of people living with TB. And the company charged this high price, even though public taxpayer and philanthropic investments in bedaquiline's R&D were 3 to 5 times the company's own. We did actually have some success in the end with that campaign. We achieved a price drop, not as big a price drop as we were looking for, but enough to make a significant difference. But high drug prices have also held back MSF's efforts to treat thousands of people living with HIV who require lifelong antiretroviral treatment. And because of expensive vaccines, MSF has struggled to scale up immunization against pneumonia, which is the leading cause of death for young children worldwide. Price has also been an issue for new life-saving direct-acting antiviral medicines for hepatitis C, such as Gilead's sofosbuvir. MSF has also pointed out how R&D neglects populations and therapeutic areas that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't see as immediately profitable. A vaccine for Ebola, for example, which MSF has been responding to for decades, did not exist until very recently because a promising vaccine candidate went neglected by private sector developers. MSF has similarly struggled to treat thousands of patients for the parasitic diseases Chagas and visceral leishmaniasis, which have been neglected in R&D efforts because they do affect smaller, poorer populations. Pediatric HIV and TB have become relatively rare in wealthy countries, so the needs of millions of children living with these diseases around the world also get overlooked. This lack of private sector interest in developing and testing new treatment regimens for diseases like TB actually spurred MSF to become directly involved in R&D efforts itself, including funding and conducting clinical trials. So even before COVID, there was rising consciousness in recent years here in the US and in other wealthy nations about the domestic effects of this broken R&D system, especially high drug prices. 40% of Americans struggle to afford their prescriptions. Many are rationing life-saving drugs like insulin, and 90% of voters say they think it's extremely important for the federal government to do something about high drug prices. This increased public consciousness has led to bipartisan interest in the subject among lawmakers. And in the US, COVID-19 has just made the failures of the R&D system even clearer, as more of us experience firsthand what it's like not to have the medicines that we need to treat people and the vaccines we need to prevent transmission of disease. So the pandemic has highlighted both the need for R&D reform and the increased transparency needed to make it happen. So what kinds of transparency are needed to reform the R&D system? MSF has called for transparency in 5 key areas, which would make it possible to better align R&D with public health need. First is R&D and manufacturing costs, including clinical trial costs. Second, terms and conditions included in R&D funding agreements should be disclosed. We should know what strings, if any, the federal government is attaching when it agrees to fund R&D projects to make sure that the products we end up with are affordable and accessible. The US government's COVID-19 vaccines contracts with companies, for example, we think should be made fully public, unredacted. There should be transparency about the prices of medical tools. The public should know what exactly companies are charging for tools in the different contexts in which they're sold. And then as our UAEM colleagues described, the public should have full access to clinical trial data. And the last kind of transparency needed is about the status of patents and other intellectual property. So we know who quote unquote owns the products and has the rights to sell them so that we can challenge any barriers limiting access. MSF has long advocated for all these kinds of disclosure, most recently at the 2019 World Health Assembly, where we pushed alongside other civil society organizations for a resolution to call for more transparency in all of these areas. We're focusing our current advocacy in the US, though, specifically on the cost of publicly funded clinical trials. This is because clinical trials make up the largest percentage of R&D expenditure, so having reliable information about clinical trial costs would open the biggest window onto overall R&D costs. NIH, for example, which plays such a big role in the discovery of almost all new drugs, holds a vast amount of cost data. And if it were made public, it would shed a huge amount of light on R&D. And as I mentioned, we think increasing transparency into clinical trial costs is achievable. First of all, lawmakers seem really interested in transparency. In recent years, there have been federal level efforts to mandate R&D cost disclosure, ranging from legislation that would compel manufacturers of all FDA approved drugs to disclose their R&D spending, to more modest bipartisan legislation that would make industry disclose R&D costs if they raised prices above a certain threshold. This last type of legislation was just reintroduced in Congress, as were some more ambitious transparency bills specific to spending on COVID R&D. Some states have also passed legislation requiring cost disclosure for price increases, which I understand has been an important area of engagement for Doctors for America. Beyond the political opportunities, though, reform at the federal level also seems feasible to us because there is this existing federal platform already in use for disclosing clinical trial results, clinicaltrials.gov, that can be adapted to report costs. In January 2020, MSF began a collaboration with Chris, who's kindly moderating today, and his students at NYU Law School to do a close study of how such disclosure could happen at NIH and exactly which data points should be collected and shared in order to give an adequate picture of clinical trial costs. Some previous and existing proposals would require only lump sum totals for R&D expenditure, but without a precise breakdown, we don't know what all is getting rolled into that number, and we can't meaningfully compare the cost of one trial with another. So the NYU reports recommends a feasible set of disaggregated data points for reporting, which the researchers think that NIH is actually already collecting, and maps out all the available policy routes to reform. They found that only small changes would be necessary to include the NIH's cost data on the website, and that there are no legal barriers to disclosure of clinical trial costs. Companies can't say, for example, that these costs are confidential commercial information. Lawmakers could amend the statute that governs clinicaltrials.gov to require NIH to post its cost data there. NIH could also make this happen through the rulemaking process. And because so much funding for COVID R&D, especially, is flowing not only through NIH, but through other agencies under HHS, particularly BARDA, we at MSF are now calling for this reform to happen across all HHS agencies. So given MSF's role as a healthcare provider, a purchaser of medical tools, and an actor in the R&D process, we want to add our voice to this debate in the US. We put out this advocacy briefing document, which you see here, explaining what we're calling for and why, and we're now trying to elevate this issue both for policymakers and the public. Also trying to connect with other stakeholders like you to help build support for reform. We welcome your partnership in this work. And we do hope to do some additional outreach on the topic in coming weeks and months with opportunities to promote on social media and other calls to action. So we'll definitely keep in close touch with both DFA and UAEM to try to keep this network posted as we develop our advocacy, and we greatly appreciate your input and support. So thanks again for including me today, and look forward to the discussion.
Amazing, thank you, Ava. As before, I have a couple questions myself, but again, I want to encourage all of our attendees to submit their questions. I will gladly yield the floor. So use the Q&A function or just put your question into chat, and I will read your question out. I guess one question, Ava, I have, if I could, is the work that you've described, including this, this technical brief, this new advocacy campaign of MSF to encourage HHS to disclose the cost of the clinical trials that the agency funds. That's obviously focused on the US, and it's clear that the US could do more. I'm curious how the US at this point compares to other countries around the world. Like, is the US lagging behind, or is this a kind of global problem?
So I definitely think it's a global problem, and in the last few years, there's been increasing global advocacy around it. I mentioned the 2019 WHA resolution at the World Health Assembly on improving the transparency of biomedical R&D, basically, and it was a proposal made by Italy, which was a pretty broad resolution, which basically would have addressed all the kinds of transparency that I mentioned, trial costs, results, patents, so forth. And MSF rallied around that, as did a lot of other civil society organizations. A contentious debate ensued where I think a lot of member states that had strong pharmaceutical sectors were opposed to elements of it. In the end, it was narrowed a fair amount, and to address just drug price transparency. MSF nonetheless saw that as a positive step. And then in the last couple of years, there's been advocacy in different contexts to try to basically realize the reforms that are recommended by that resolution. And I don't know, perhaps facilitated by COVID, there was a major event over the summer in July, while Italy was recovering from its first wave of COVID, where they passed a very strong transparency law that included disclosures about public subsidies received for drug development, R&D costs, sales revenue, marketing costs, the status of patents and prices charged in other countries. It also included basically a requirement that companies prove therapeutic benefit for over an existing treatment in order to bring it to market. And then this past November, there was also a law passed in France, again, narrower, I think, than its originators had hoped, but that was about disclosures of public funding received, basically, for R&D. So it's happening. There's interest in it around the world. I think the US in doing this kind of detailed clinical trial cost disclosure would be leading, and much in the same way that they've created the world's biggest clinical trial results database, have an opportunity to basically set a norm that would have a global reach.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had not known about all the developments in foreign law. It sounds like just in the last year or so, I guess due to the COVID pandemic, but it seems to me like cause for cautious optimism that countries like France are embracing various pieces of like the kind of, they're working on pieces of the overall transparency puzzle if they're not necessarily tackling the whole thing at once. But yeah, it does strike me, I know, I'm biased because we've worked together on this, but it just seems to me that the US government is the world's single largest funder of clinical trials. There's just a really rich reservoir of data on what it costs to run a clinical trial that we here in the US could unlock if we could just convince our legislators and policymakers to make that valuable information public. So I'm really excited to see where your advocacy goes.
Thank you, Chris. I would feel the same.
Yeah. So I have a couple more questions, but I don't want to hog the floor. I don't know if Reshma or Nilu or Daphne or anyone else has questions for Ava or other points you want to raise. And then folks in the audience too, feel free again to drop questions into chat or pose them via the Q&A.
One question I do have, just given what Doctors for America has been working on fairly recently, both at the state level and federal level, policies to curb rising drug prices, either through negotiation at the federal level, but at the state level, this idea of a prescription drug affordability board. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how transparency of clinical trial costs kind of ties in with these kind of enforcement or stick mechanisms to cut down on the prices of prescription drugs that we're seeing here in the United States.
you may know, more about it even than I do, but to me, it's clear they go hand in hand. In order to negotiate, you have to have the numbers and the complete numbers, and not just pieced together numbers from a variety of sources, and that are not comparable to one another. So I think for robust negotiation, there has to be a full set of data to draw on.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that because I can't help it. Sorry. I feel wholeheartedly agree with Ava that data on the cost of clinical trials and data on the cost of every component of the R&D process and on manufacturing and distribution, sort of information on the costs all through the life cycle of inventing, developing, proving the safety and efficacy of, and then manufacturing and distributing a drug. We need that information to have an informed policy debate about what drugs should cost. And right now, the data that we have is really piecemeal, inconsistent. Much of it, I think, is supplied by the same companies that we're negotiating against. And they obviously have strong incentives to fudge the numbers to make it look more expensive than perhaps it maybe really is to develop some of these products. And I think this data is so rich and so important, both to have near-term debates about pricing, negotiations over price, but also longer-term debates about what type of sort of law and policy model, what sort of ecosystem of pharmaceutical development we want. So if we, for example, want to imagine shifting some more resources into the public sector and having, let's say, NIH or other government agencies do end-to-end drug discovery and development, even having manufacturing done in the public sector, as like Senator Warren and Representative Schakowsky have proposed, we need to know what it costs. So I think the work of MSF and UAM is really exciting on this score, trying to get good information out to the world.
So I was going to also ask, our DFA members or, working at a number of academic institutions that have been targets for the UAM report for prescribing drugs that oftentimes we're not really sure how safe and effective they are. We're just given information, through the drug labels or whatever trials might be available, or sometimes even our patients kind of referring us to pharmaceutical company advertisements and other sorts of detailing that occurs at our own conferences sponsored by companies. And I'm just kind of curious from your guys' perspective, what can we as clinicians do to help enhance this transparency? Because personally for me, I think it's my worst nightmare to prescribe a drug that I don't know for sure how safe and effective it is, how it compares to other things that might be on the market already that might be more cost effective or more affordable for my patients. And then at the same time, putting my patients in a precarious financial situation of having to pay way more than what it's actually worth. So I'm curious about what you guys feel are like the steps that clinicians can take both at their local institution, but even thinking about in advocacy to kind of, push forward on clinical trials transparency, especially now.
I mean, one thing I'll say just to start off in terms of advocacy is really just to make it known that there is demand for this type of more detailed, more transparent information. One of the biggest pushbacks we get when we talk about results reporting, and especially summary results reporting on clinicaltrials.gov, is nobody reads it. Like, the information is not accessible, nobody cares, nobody's going to go in and look at all of these details. Why should we bother putting all of this effort into making these reports available within 12 months. So I think if we can make it clear that clinicians specifically have use for this data and can use it in their practice and to use it in developing plans of care for their patients, I think that's a really strong argument to actually tighten the procedure and to really push people towards making that information available.
Yeah, I would just echo that and say, I think the value really lies in the stories that clinicians bring. So we as students may not have these patient experiences that demonstrate why this issue is important, but I think clinicians can really speak to that and say that, this is actually impacting people's lives at the end of the day. So it does connect the issue back to access to medicines and, healthcare, and how we can really ensure that patient lives are at the forefront, and, we're not making any mistakes on that end. So I think that's, if we can all combine voices and really strengthen that narrative, I think that's the best way to approach this.
Well, it looks like we're at the top of the hour, so this was like absolutely fantastic. I will say, like, COVID-19, I think, has just exemplified, the need for clinical trial transparency. I think clinicians, patients alike, we're all desperate to know just how safe and effective, all the products that are coming down the market are. And thankfully, because of the availability of data through public pressure, that is now out there that we can access readily, we have a lot more confidence in terms of COVID-19 vaccines in particular. And I think this is just like a case study and an example to your guys' point, just how needed and wanted this sort of information is, not just for scientists or regulators or even clinicians, but really for everyone, the entire public, to be able to understand the landscape. And the same thing with costs. We're just seeing so many more patients having difficulty affording the medicines that we prescribe them, that it's now more important than ever for us to have the tools to be able to negotiate what a fair price is for them. And transparency is really the only way we're going to be able to effectively do that. So I can't thank you both, or all of you, Daphne, Nilu from UAM, Ava from MSF, for your advocacy and leadership in this area, and Chris for your incredible work as well across these fronts to help protect our patients. On behalf of Doctors for America and really clinicians who are really wanting to make sure we prescribe safe, effective, and affordable drugs, thank you so much. And thank you for coming to come speak with us today.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. Once again, glad to answer any questions by email, and I give or glad to keep in touch with anyone who's interested in this stuff. And so grateful for the event. Thank you all.